Arthur Finch considered his corner lot at 4I-26 Azalea Drive less a piece of property and more a statement. It was a 25-foot radius of obsessive perfection, the only property in the whole Sunstone Hills community that could rival the golf course itself. The emerald zoysia grass was cut to precisely 1.5 inches. The beds were bordered with hand-set Belgian block, and the mature azaleas looked like oil paintings. He didn't just maintain it. He curated it. It was the only part of his chaotic, bureaucratic life he felt he could truly control. That control was repeatedly violated by a single, diesel-fueled act of contempt. It happened every Tuesday and Friday at 9:15 a.m., as reliable as sunrise. The massive white Ford F-650 dump truck, emblazoned with the logo of Apex Landscaping Solutions, the HOA's contracted maintenance service, would approach the corner. Instead of navigating the curve like a civilized human being, the driver, a woman named Brenda Vance, would cut the 90-degree turn by swinging the truck's rear axle and tandem wheels a full 4 feet onto Arthur's lawn. The result was 2 parallel ruts, deep and ugly, carved into his pristine turf, followed by a cloud of pulverized topsoil. The first time, Arthur had reacted with restrained annoyance. The 20th time, he reacted with a fury that felt cold and surgical. He was waiting for her this Tuesday. He stood precisely on the property line, a line invisible to everyone but him, arms crossed over his chest, his posture rigid enough to challenge the very concept of momentum. He was a man who worked with numbers, a senior actuary, and he treated this conflict as a problem of statistics and logic, which was why her continued defiance felt like a personal insult to mathematics itself. The F-650 groaned to a stop 3 feet from him, the massive grille towering over Arthur. Brenda, a woman whose face was permanently set in an expression of bored tolerance, killed the engine and peered down. Her uniform shirt was slightly too tight, and she wore a pair of mirror sunglasses that made her eyes unreadable, reflecting only the harsh morning sun and Arthur's own frustrated face. "Problem, pal," she barked, chewing gum loudly. "Yes, Miss Vance," Arthur said, his voice measured but carrying an edge of ice. "My problem is that you are on my lawn. Again, that is private property. Do you see the curb? The asphalt? Those are for your 4-ton vehicle. The grass is not." Brenda sighed, a theatrical display of patience being tried. She didn't bother to remove her sunglasses. "Look, I'm making a tight turn, cutting the corner. It saves me 5 seconds. It's grass, man! It grows back." "That is an utterly irresponsible and factually incorrect statement," Arthur countered, stepping closer to point at a fresh, ugly scar of tire tread that had torn up his newly laid sod. "It doesn't just grow back. That is a $300 damage repair. That requires core aeration, backfilling with enriched soil, reseeding, and netting. And next time you will just destroy it again. You are trespassing, Brenda, repeatedly." She laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Trespassing? Get real. I'm driving for the HOA. I'm servicing the neighborhood. It's common ground out here." "No, it is my ground. I pay property taxes on it. The curb is the delineation. You are in violation of multiple community covenants, conditions and restrictions, specifically Section 4B, vandalism and property damage, and Section 7A, vehicle operation and right-of-way." Arthur had the sections memorized. Brenda pulled the gum from her mouth and slapped it onto the dashboard. "Listen, Mr. Lawman, you want to talk rules? My route has 30 stops. You think I'm gonna 4-point turn this beast on every damn corner? Get a life. I'll make sure to kick up extra dust next time." She dropped the truck into gear, the air brakes hissing, and she rolled forward, forcing Arthur to take a quick, instinctive step back. The truck lumbered past, leaving the stench of diesel and a fresh spike of adrenaline in Arthur's blood. He walked back inside, the heat from the confrontation turning his stomach sour. Janet, his wife, a kind-eyed woman who usually viewed HOA drama with the detachment of an anthropologist studying a strange tribe, watched him from the kitchen island. "The Tuesday ritual?" she asked softly. "She's escalating," Arthur said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She threatened to do it again. She knows she's protected by the HOA contract. She's arrogant. Arthur, just call the board. Document it. Don't get into a shouting match with a woman driving a vehicle the size of a small tank. I've documented it. I have 22 time-stamped photos, 3 videos, and a topographical map showing the exact depth of the ruts. I have an entire binder, Janet. It's called the Apex File. I've sent 3 certified letters to Ted Harrington, the HOA president, and 12 emails to the management company. The response, when it finally arrived 3 days later, was a masterwork of bureaucratic incompetence. It was a form letter from Ted Harrington himself, titled Vehicle Route Adjustments, addressed generically to resident. Arthur read it aloud to Janet later that evening, his voice shaking with disbelief. The Sunstone Hills Board is aware of concerns regarding service vehicle operation and is committed to maintaining the highest quality of life for all residents. We have reminded Apex Landscaping to exercise due caution and courtesy on residential routes. We consider this matter resolved. Resolved? Janet stared. That's it? That doesn't even mention the trespass. It gets better, Arthur said, slamming the letter onto the dining table. I spoke to Ted. He told me, off the record, that Apex is the cheapest bid they've gotten in 5 years, and they are not going to risk the contract over a little grass. He literally called my meticulous, prize-winning, time-consuming effort of maintaining this property a little grass. A week passed. Friday morning came. 9:15 a.m., Arthur hadn't just stood there this time. He had built defenses, not aggressive ones, not spikes or ditches. He was smart. He had purchased a dozen charming, solar-powered ceramic mushrooms and placed them meticulously along the curve where Brenda typically drove, slightly inside his property line but positioned perfectly to force her to widen her turn. He even added a low, 3-foot-tall decorative wooden lattice fence, purely ornamental, designed to be visibly inside the property line, a clear, unmistakable visual warning. When Brenda's F-650 arrived, Arthur watched from the window. Heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, she saw the mushrooms. She saw the little fence. She slowed down. Arthur felt a surge of triumph, believing the combination of visual barriers and the subtle threat of legal liability had finally penetrated her thick skull. Then, she accelerated. She steered the massive truck intentionally into the corner, directly over the decorative wooden fence, which splintered and snapped like kindling under the front passenger tire. The tires crushed 5 of the ceramic mushrooms into dust, the solar panels popping like cheap fireworks, before she powered through the turn and was gone. The damage was immediate and devastating, far worse than just ruts. It was an act of malice. Arthur stood in the ruined dirt, holding a shard of the blue ceramic mushroom, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a terrifying, cold realization. He was dealing with someone who not only had contempt for the rules, but had the protection of the HOA to enforce that contempt. She wasn't just doing a job, she was winning a power struggle, and the system was her shield. Janet was crying when he walked back in. "She's terrible," called the police. "That's willful destruction of property, Arthur." "The police won't get involved in an HOA dispute," Arthur said, his voice flat. He walked past her and went to his study. He sat at his desk, staring out the window at the ruined corner. He was beyond anger now. Anger was inefficient. Anger led to mistakes. What he felt was a profound, chilling clarity. He had tried the correct, bureaucratic, and legal path, and it had failed catastrophically. The rule breaker was immune. He pulled up the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions one last time. He scrolled past 4B and 7A. He scrolled to Section 5C. Temporary installations and maintenance. It stipulated that only the HOA could install permanent fixtures on the common ground or adjacent. Private property if said fixture was deemed a necessity for safety or route efficiency and did not cause undue personal harm or property damage to the non-HOA entity. Arthur closed the file. He wasn't going to call the police. He wasn't going to call the HOA. He was going to use the HOA's own language, necessity for safety and route efficiency, against them. He would install a deterrent so subtle, so safe, and so perfectly positioned that it would solve the problem entirely without creating a legal liability. It had to be undeniable, immovable, and most importantly, invisible to anyone who was driving correctly. The next morning, the HOA letter arrived. It wasn't about the destroyed mushrooms or the splintered fence. Dear Mr. Finch, this letter serves as a formal written warning and notification of a $250 fine for the unauthorized installation of obstructions, decorative fence, and ceramic objects on or near the common area property line in violation of CCNR Section 5C. Arthur stared at the paper, the cold fury returning, sharper this time. The victim was being punished for erecting a feeble defense against his aggressor. Brenda Vance, the destroyer, was now officially justified. He went to the garage, his movements economical and precise. He didn't look at the ruin outside. He opened a rarely used metal cabinet and pulled out a contractor grade level and a spool of high-visibility marking line. Arthur Finch's garage had always been a sanctuary of order. Tools organized by size, solvents categorized by chemical composition, and a pristine work surface reserved for financial modeling. Now it was a covert operations center. The HOA fine, the ultimate bureaucratic slap in the face, had provided the final necessary emotional fuel. He wasn't acting out of rage. He was acting out of statistical necessity. He was balancing the ledger. He spent the weekend drafting a detailed site plan. Using the 22 time-stamped photographs and the topographical map from the Apex file, Arthur calculated the precise parabolic path of the inner tandem wheel of Brenda's F650. The resulting line, drawn in red Sharpie across a laminated aerial photo of his property, was the zero-tolerance zone. His deterrent, he reasoned, could not be placed where the tire should be, but exactly where the tire was guaranteed to trespass. His shipment arrived late Saturday morning, not in a marked box from an industrial supplier, but discreetly bundled in thick, unmarked gray canvas, delivered by an independent freight service. Arthur had paid a premium for the discretion and the expedited rush. The deterrent itself wasn't spectacular, but brutally functional. 3 low-profile recycled polymer curb stops. They were jet black, dense, and weighed nearly 50 pounds each. Critically, they were only 4 inches high, too low to scrape the undercarriage of a car turning normally, but high enough to deliver a violent, undeniable stop to a truck tire that tried to climb them. Their installation required 3 24-inch galvanized steel spikes per unit, sunk deep into the earth. Once installed, they were immovable, blending perfectly with the dark underlying soil, easily concealed by a thin layer of turf, especially to a driver speeding through a turn from an elevated cab. Arthur's work began at dawn on Sunday. He dressed in old clothes and approached the corner lot, the scene of the recent ceramic massacre. Janet stood in the doorway, clutching a coffee mug. "Arthur, what are you doing? I thought you were just going to hire someone to repair the damage." "I am performing preventative maintenance, Janet," he said, his voice clipped. He pulled a heavy spade from the back of the truck. "If I only repair the damage, the cycle repeats. That's an inefficient, non-optimized strategy. I am installing a long-term solution." "A solution to what? A landscaping truck?" "Arthur, this is going to get worse." "You got fined for the mushrooms!" "What is that thing?" "It's a passive safety measure," he said, avoiding her eyes. He couldn't afford to explain the precise legality of the situation. He was operating in a tight ethical and legal corridor, and he didn't want Janet's reasonable, emotional perspective to cloud his mathematical execution. He had reread the HOA's Section 5C, the rule used to fine him. It permitted no private structures that caused undue personal harm or property damage to the non-HOA entity. Undue personal harm? The curb stop was designed for parking lots. It was meant to be safe. Property damage to the non-HOA entity? The curb stop was on his property. The damage would be borne by Brenda's tire, but only because it trespassed. If she stayed on the asphalt, there was no consequence. He started digging a narrow, precise trench along the red line of his calculation. He worked for 3 grueling hours. The physical labor was a welcome release for the pent-up frustration of weeks of bureaucratic warfare. Each swing of the spade was a rejection of Ted Harrington's form letter and Brenda Vance's arrogant smirk. The first curb stop went in at 8:30 a.m. He leveled the polymer block, drove the steel spikes deep into the subsoil, and then, using the zoysia sod he had carefully peeled up, he meticulously concealed the top of the deterrent. From the street, it was completely invisible, just freshly turned earth and a slightly raised patch of sod that would settle in a day. He placed the 3 blocks 6 feet apart, ensuring they would bracket the wide tires of the F650, making it impossible to slip past them. He was creating a 4-foot-wide minefield of consequence, entirely on his land. A shadow fell over him. It was Mrs. Petrov, his neighbor from across the street, walking her miniature poodle, Fluffy. "Mr. Finch, what on earth is going on here?" she asked, her voice a low, judgmental hiss. "It looks like you're burying something. Is that what I think it is? Are you trying to trap that nice landscaping girl?" Arthur straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. He activated his actuary persona, calm and authoritative. "Good morning, Mrs. Petrov. I am installing ground-level structural support elements to prevent long-term erosion damage caused by repeated heavy vehicle traffic on my private property. I have obtained the proper industrial-grade materials to ensure safety and minimal visual impact, as per community standards." Mrs. Petrov narrowed her eyes. "It looks like a speed bump in your yard, Mr. Finch. I'm calling Ted." "Please do, Mrs. Petrov," Arthur said with a completely genuine smile. "I'm sure the board would appreciate knowing a resident is proactively taking steps to mitigate long-term maintenance costs for all parties." "Have a lovely Sunday," Mrs. Petrov huffed and walked away, pulling Fluffy along. Arthur knew he had just bought himself a few days of grace before Ted Harrington was forced to address the issue. The installation had to be complete, and the deterrent operational before Tuesday morning's inevitable trespass. Monday was spent applying the final touches. He sprayed the freshly disturbed sod with a nutrient solution to ensure rapid rerouting and swept the entire perimeter, leaving no trace of his industrial-grade intervention. The corner looked exactly as it had before Brenda's last destructive run, except for the dark, steel-spiked hearts buried beneath the surface. That night, the tension in the Finch household was a tangible thing. "Arthur, you haven't slept properly in 3 days," Janet said, standing over him as he sat in his study, reviewing the F650's detailed specifications he'd found online: tire height, ground clearance, axle width. "Tell me exactly what you put out there." "They're recycled polymer wheel chocks, essentially," he said, not looking up. "Securely anchored. Non-damaging to vehicles, provided the vehicle stays on the pavement, which is where the vehicle belongs. And if the vehicle doesn't stay on the pavement, if Brenda drives over it?" Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were cold, professional. "Then the vehicle will be stopped, suddenly, and the tires will sustain a degree of stress equivalent to driving over a stationary low-profile barrier. It's an undeniable, non-negotiable physical consequence to an intentional violation of a boundary." "And the noise? And the damage to her truck?" Janet's voice was strained. "They'll fire her and she'll sue you, and the HOA will ban us from the community pool for life. You've built a trap, Arthur." "I have built a solution," Arthur corrected, his voice hardening. "A solution that only affects the aggressor when the aggressor is actively aggressing. It's the purest form of physics-based justice. It's safe. It forces her to comply. And because the HOA only fines me for obstructions, and these are now subsurface, integral structural supports and not decorations, the fine is legally contestable." Janet shook her head, tears welling up. "You're not Arthur anymore. You're a man obsessed with a corner of grass. You're becoming as rigid and terrible as the rules you hate. That cut deeper than the HOA fine." Arthur didn't respond. He simply looked back down at the technical drawing of the tire stop, the silence in the room heavier than the 50-pound polymer blocks outside. Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Arthur was dressed in a crisp, clean shirt, sitting by the dining room window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Janet refused to watch. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes with unnecessary vigor, the sound of clattering ceramic a percussion track for the silence. Arthur felt his pulse spiking. This wasn't a financial presentation. This wasn't a model he could run and adjust. This was the real world. Physics and consequence meeting contempt and momentum. The stakes felt enormous. Failure meant not only a repeat of the destruction and more fines, but the total dissolution of his sense of control, possibly even his marriage. 14 a.m. the low, heavy rumble began, growing steadily louder. The sound of the F650, the noise he had come to despise, was approaching. Arthur's hand was shaking slightly as he brought the cold coffee cup to his lips. He saw the truck crest the rise, Brenda's signature reckless speed evident in its approach. 15 a.m. The F-650 reached the corner. Brenda didn't slow down. She had been warned by Ted, she had been harassed by Arthur, and now she had seen the victim get fined. She knew she had won. Her sunglasses reflected the morning light with brazen confidence. She pulled the wheel to the right, beginning the familiar, contemptuous, corner-cutting maneuver. The massive front tire, then the dual rear tires, swung wide, perfectly aligned with the zero-tolerance zone, perfectly positioned to crush the soft sod. Arthur saw the front tire roll silently over the first disguised block. Nothing happened. The tire was large enough and the block low enough that the initial contact was absorbed by the heavy rubber. Arthur's heart sank. Had he failed? Was the block too low? Then the second tire, the first of the tandem wheels, hit the second block. Clang! The sound was an industrial metallic slam, a violent interruption of momentum. It wasn't the soft crunch of grass being torn. It was the hard, non-negotiable impact of a heavy object against an immovable force. The entire 4-ton truck lurched violently to the left, the cab momentarily dipping with the force of the sudden, uneven saint. The moment Arthur suggested calling a tow truck, Brenda Vance's rage solidified into dangerous, crystalline intent. She reached for her cell phone, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped it on the asphalt. "You think this is over, Finch? You crippled a corporate vehicle on the clock. That's interference with contract. That's criminal mischief. Enjoy the litigation." Her voice was a ragged snarl, raw with the humiliation of being defeated by a man with a coffee cup and a measuring tape. Arthur remained perfectly still on his porch, radiating the calm of a man who had already run the liability model. "I suggest you read the contract you signed with Apex Landscaping. I imagine it has a clause regarding driver's responsibility for property damage, not to mention compliance with local traffic laws which, I remind you, prohibit reckless endangerment and obstruction of a roadway. At this moment, your company vehicle is the only legal liability here." Before Brenda could respond, a sleek, black sedan pulled up sharply behind the immobilized F-650. The driver's door flew open and Ted Harrington, the HOA president, spilled out. Ted was a man built entirely of nervous energy and pleated khakis, perpetually stressed by the thankless task of managing affluent, entitled residents. He saw the massive truck listing awkwardly, the crowd of curious neighbors gathering on the sidewalks, and the exposed black polymer blocks. His face went white. "What in God's name happened here?" Ted demanded, rushing up to Brenda, ignoring Arthur entirely. Brenda immediately seized the opportunity. "This lunatic! This Finch guy! He buried industrial road hazards in his lawn, Ted. They're landmines! I hit them going around the corner and they almost flipped the truck. My neck is killing me. This is a personal injury hazard, a massive safety breach." Ted looked from the immobilized truck to the ominous black blocks, then finally turned his frantic attention to Arthur. "Finch, what is this?" "I explicitly fined you for putting obstructions out here." "I warned you." "You fined me for the ceramic mushrooms and the decorative lattice fence," Arthur corrected calmly, descending the steps and walking toward the curb. He made sure to stop exactly on his property line. "I removed them immediately upon receiving your notice of violation. I then replaced them with these." He gestured to the visible steel-spiked polymer blocks. "Those are even worse. They're hidden. They're industrial. This is an immediate violation, a massive liability for the community. Get them out of the ground now!" Ted was practically vibrating with panic. "No, Ted, I won't," Arthur stated, his voice ringing with the certitude of his actuarial calculations. "They are subsurface, anchored structural supports, placed entirely on my private property to mitigate repeated documented property destruction caused by a contracted HOA vendor. Furthermore, they comply with Section 5C of the CCNRs," Ted sputtered. "Comply? You were fined under 5C for decorative obstructions." "Read the section again, Ted. It specifically prohibits structures that cause undue personal harm or property damage to the non-HOA entity. These wheel stops are standard, passive vehicle control devices used in parking garages nationwide. They are 4 inches tall. They pose no harm to any vehicle operating on the public asphalt. They only interact with a vehicle that is actively and intentionally trespassing on my private land. The only damage caused is to the trespassing tire, and that damage is a direct, proportional consequence of the driver's choice. Arthur then leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially, though ensuring Brenda could hear every word. Ted, I have a file containing 23 documented, time-stamped trespasses, including the destruction of a newly installed decorative barrier, for which the HOA offered zero remediation, but instead fined the victim. If this matter goes to litigation, and Apex Landscaping claims this is a trap, I will argue that the HOA's failure to enforce its own rules on its contractor created a demonstrable necessity for me to employ a passive defense mechanism on my private property. Apex's claim would be against your negligence, not my defense. Ted's panicked expression shifted to a terrified calculation. Arthur had just given him the equation for the community's legal exposure. The liability was suddenly not Arthur's, but the HOA's for enabling the trespasser. The situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. Another vehicle, a large, pristine black pickup truck with the Apex Landscaping logo, screeched to a halt nearby. Out stepped a man in a crisp polo shirt, Jerry Dolan, the regional manager for Apex. He took one look at the F-650, saw Brenda's furious stance, and then saw Arthur. "Brenda, what the hell is going on? Why is the truck dead in the road?" Jerry barked. "It's him, Mr. Dolan. He booby-trapped his lawn. He ripped up the grass and put in concrete roadblocks. Look!" Brenda pointed dramatically at the exposed polymer. Jerry Dolan walked over, his face hardening as he took in the scene. He ignored Ted and focused entirely on Arthur. "You're the Finch guy, aren't you? The one who keeps complaining about a little dirt? You realize that truck is leased. That's commercial property. Any damage to the tires, the axle, or the suspension is going to be billed directly to you and the HOA. We've already lost 3 hours of operational time. That's $400 an hour minimum. Apex Landscaping will be filing a police report for destruction of property and a civil suit for damages and lost revenue by the close of business today." The escalation was exactly what Arthur had anticipated. He finally put down his coffee cup, the clink of ceramic against the asphalt sounding like the gavel of judgment. "Mr. Dolan," Arthur said, his demeanor flawless, "the only property destruction here was performed by your driver on my lawn. She willingly drove a 4-ton vehicle across a clearly defined property boundary. That device," Arthur pointed to the exposed block, "is called a recycled polymer wheel stop. It is designed to stop a vehicle from trespassing without deploying an airbag or causing structural damage. It is safely secured on my land. I suggest you photograph the tread marks on the block and compare them to the tire. You will find no punctures, only surface abrasion. Apex's liability is not with me. It's with your driver, Brenda Vance, for the operational delay caused by her continued failure to use the public roadway." Ted Harrington, feeling the legal heat from both sides, stepped between them. "All right, enough. This is a public disturbance. Jerry, you need to get that truck moved. Finch, I want those supports removed by tomorrow morning. We will have an emergency board meeting tonight to determine a resolution. And if I don't remove them," Arthur challenged. His eyes locked with Ted's. Ted hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. "Then the community will authorize the immediate, forced removal of the obstruction, and you will be billed for the labor and fined daily until compliance is achieved. We can and will file an injunction." "Then I look forward to that legal proceeding, Ted," Arthur replied coolly, "because I will be countersuing the HOA for the costs incurred repairing the damage your contractor has repeatedly caused, and for the unjust fine levied against my previous, purely decorative efforts at mitigation." The tension was a taut wire, ready to snap. Jerry Dolan climbed back into his black truck, pulling out his phone, presumably to call the Apex legal team. Brenda stood by her immobilized F-650, watching Arthur with pure, undiluted hatred. Inside the house, Janet was leaning against the kitchen wall, her face pale. When Arthur walked in, the cool resolve he displayed outside instantly broke against her emotional wall. "You saw the look on that man's face, Arthur," Janet whispered, her voice choked. "A lawsuit! A major corporation! Over a patch of grass! They're going to bankrupt us just to make a point. They're going to sell the house right out from under us. They are bluffing, Janet, Arthur insisted, running a hand through his hair. It's cheaper for Apex to fire Brenda and change the route than it is to sue an actuary who has meticulously documented every possible angle of their liability. I'm protected. You think your numbers protect us from this kind of malice? This isn't a spreadsheet, Arthur. This is our life! You have traded our peace for pride, and I can't stand here and watch you destroy everything because you can't let go of a corner lot. She turned her back on him, the emotional stakes now far exceeding the square footage of zoysia grass. Arthur was alone, victorious in the skirmish, but facing a looming, devastating war on two fronts, the HOA and his marriage. That evening, the official email arrived urgent. Mandatory emergency board meeting, subject, resolution regarding 4026 Azalea Drive and vendor contract compliance time, 7:00 p.m. tonight. HOA Clubhouse required attendance, Mr. Arthur Finch, 4026 Azalea Drive, Mr. Jerry Dolan, Apex Landscaping, Ted Harrington, HOA President. Arthur stared at the screen. He wasn't just being fined or warned anymore. He was being summoned. The bureaucracy had chosen its arena, and he had to step into the lion's den, armed only with the cold, hard logic of the CCNRs and his unshakable belief in the justice of physics. The HOA clubhouse meeting room was a sterile, unforgiving arena. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting harshly off the polished formica table where the three board members, Ted Harrington, Mrs. Patel, treasurer, and Mr. Chen, secretary, sat looking grim. The air was thick with the scent of bad coffee and mutual resentment. Arthur sat facing them, impeccably dressed, a leather briefcase containing the Apex file resting squarely on the table before him. Across the table, Jerry Dolan from Apex Landscaping leaned back aggressively, his arms crossed over his chest, flanked by a nervous-looking, red-faced Brenda Vance. Ted Harrington tapped a pen against a notepad, the sound echoing in the tension. All right, let's bring this to order. The purpose of this emergency session is to address two pressing issues. One, the immediate removal of unauthorized structures at 4026 Azalea Drive, and two, the claim for damages and breach of contract filed verbally by Apex Landscaping this morning. Ted shot a venomous look at Arthur. Jerry, why don't you start by outlining Apex's position? Jerry Dolan didn't waste time. He launched into a polished corporate tirade, speaking with the practiced ease of someone used to intimidating homeowners. Thank you. Mr. Harrington, Apex Landscaping views this incident as an act of malicious, premeditated vandalism. Mr. Finch installed hidden, industrial-grade polymer blocks, which we consider a booby trap, directly in the path of a commercial vehicle. This resulted in the complete immobilization of our F-650 dump truck, the immediate damage to one of our commercial tires, and over 5 hours of lost operational time. We are submitting an immediate claim for $3,500 in damages and lost revenue. Furthermore, we demand that the HOA immediately authorize the removal of these dangerous hazards and ban Mr. Finch from installing any future structural elements on his front property line. This is a fundamental safety issue and a clear violation of our vendor contract's guarantee of unobstructed access. He leaned forward, placing a glossy printout of the exposed polymer block on the table. This is not a garden gnome, Mr. Finch. It's an act of aggression. Mrs. Patel, the treasurer, looked deeply worried. Mr. Dolan, who authorized the tow? And what is the precise damage to the vehicle? We towed it ourselves, Mrs. Patel, on an emergency basis. The damage is a sidewall abrasion and potential alignment issues due to the sudden, violent impact. Our driver, Ms. Vance, suffered whiplash and has been advised to seek medical attention. Brenda nodded vigorously, clutching her neck for effect. Ted looked at Arthur with resignation. Mr. Finch, I think the evidence is fairly conclusive. You were explicitly warned. You have created an unacceptable liability for this community. The board will vote now on the forced removal unless you have a compelling legal reason why we shouldn't. Arthur finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost soothing, cutting through Jerry's aggressive performance like a laser through mist. I do. Ted, I have 23 compelling reasons, each of which is time-stamped, photographed, and notarized. He opened his briefcase, revealing the immaculate binder, the Apex file. He slid 3 documents across the table, one to each board member. What you are viewing, Mr. Dolan, is not a booby trap. It is a proportional passive defense mechanism against repeated documented trespass installed on private property. The device is a 4-inch high, commercially available wheel stop. It is designed to stop a vehicle from overshooting a boundary. Your truck, Mr. Dolan, has 22 inches of ground clearance. If Ms. Vance had operated the vehicle on the public asphalt as required by law, the wheel stop would have been entirely inert. It is not an obstruction to vehicles operating correctly. Arthur shifted his focus to Ted. Ted, the board's immediate concern is liability. Let's address that using the HOA's own documents. The board sent me a fine under Section 5C stating my previous purely decorative efforts were unauthorized obstructions. This created a legal precedent. By fining the victim of property damage for attempting a decorative mitigation, the HOA effectively declared that all non-HOA defenses were prohibited, while simultaneously refusing to enforce the anti-vandalism clauses against their vendor. He leaned toward the board. This failure created a legal vacuum. My action was taken out of necessity. I replaced the decorative elements with subsurface structural elements that comply with the exact letter of Section 5C by posing zero undue personal harm and only interact with a vehicle actively committing an illegal trespass on private land. Mrs. Patel, the treasurer, spoke up, her voice sharp with financial concern. Mr. Dolan, your driver, Ms. Vance, has a pattern of driving onto the corner. Mr. Finch's documentation is meticulous. If we authorize the removal of his property and Apex continues to trespass, the HOA becomes financially liable for every future incidence of property damage, having actively removed the only proven deterrent. Jerry Dolan scoffed. This is insane. The man is claiming his little rubber bump is a better lawyer than my team. We have a contract with you, Ted. If you don't remove this hazard, we will terminate the contract immediately and bill you the early termination fee, which is $15,000. This threat landed like a grenade. Ted's eyes went wide, and Mr. Chen nervously shuffled his papers. Arthur waited for the silence to stretch, then delivered his true tactical strike. Ted, Mr. Dolan is using scare tactics. He mentions his contract. I also reviewed the Apex Landscaping Services master contract, dated January 2023, which is a public record available to all HOA residents. Arthur pulled out a single sheet of paper from his file. Under Section 8D, Compliance and Termination for Cause, it states Apex shall maintain professional and safe operation of all vehicles at all times, including strict adherence to all local traffic ordinances and avoidance of private property trespass. It further states that repeated, documented breaches of 8D shall constitute grounds for contract termination by the HOA without penalty or fees. He placed the contract copy in front of Ted. Mr. Dolan, I have 23 documented breaches of 8D on one property alone. I suggest that the cost of your alleged lost revenue and a single tire abrasion is dwarfed by the $15,000 termination fee the HOA would happily save by terminating your contract for cause right now. This is a problem of your employee's insolence, not my lawn's defense. Jerry Dolan's jaw clenched. Brenda Vance suddenly looked very small and pale. The board members, who only saw dollar signs, were now entirely on Arthur's side. They loved saving $15,000 more than they hated Arthur. Mrs. Patel, smiling faintly for the first time, spoke to Ted. Mr. Harrington, based on the clear breach of Section 8D, I move that the board rejects Apex Landscaping's claim for damages and lost revenue. And furthermore, we vote to issue a final, official warning to Apex to cease all trespass immediately or face contract termination. Mr. Chen quickly seconded the motion. Ted Harrington, defeated, his authority completely undermined, could only stammer, all in favor. The vote was unanimous, 3-0 against Apex, 3-0 in favor of Arthur's legal position. Jerry Dolan exploded. He shoved his chair back, the sound scraping against the floor. This is preposterous. You are protecting a vigilante. Apex will be pulling all services from this community first thing tomorrow, regardless of the contract. You can mow your own damn grass, Finch. He grabbed Brenda by the arm and stormed out, leaving the three board members sitting in stunned, relieved silence. Arthur collected his file. "Thank you, board members. I trust this matter is resolved. The structural supports will remain in place until the vendor demonstrates consistent adherence to the contract." As Arthur was leaving, Ted Harrington called out, his voice hoarse. "Finch, why did you have the contract? How did you get it?" Arthur paused at the door, turning back to face the broken-spirited president. He gave a small, cold smile that held no warmth, only the finality of a perfectly run calculation. "Ted, I am an actuary. I specialize in quantifying and mitigating risk. When the system failed to protect me, I decided to quantify your risk. It turns out my personal property damage was a low-probability, high-frequency event. Your contractual vulnerability to Apex, however, was a high-probability, high-consequence risk. I merely connected the dots. The contract was my ultimate deterrent, and my lawn was just the trigger." He walked out, leaving the board to deal with the immediate chaos of having no landscaper, but having successfully sidestepped a $15,000 threat thanks to the very homeowner they had tried to fine. Outside, Janet was waiting in the car, her expression still etched with worry, but Arthur felt a sense of clean, terrifying liberation. He had won the battle, but the war for peace in the community had just. The silence in the Finch family car on the drive back from the clubhouse was the heaviest element Arthur had ever encountered, denser than the polymer wheel stops anchored in his lawn. He had achieved total, irrefutable victory. He had defeated the reckless contractor, neutralized the predatory corporate threat, and exposed the incompetence of the HOA board, all with the power of meticulous preparation and logic. Yet, the air in the car was colder than any actuarial table. Arthur finally broke the tension, his voice tired but carrying the ring of satisfied conviction. "They folded completely, Janet. The $3,500 damage claim vanished, and we saved the community the $15,000 termination fee. I proved my action was a necessary proportional defense against repeated tortious interference. The case is closed." Janet did not look at him. She stared straight through the windshield at the darkening landscape of their pristine uniform community. "You won a contract termination, Arthur. You didn't win peace. You didn't win a marriage. You just proved you're willing to burn the whole thing down to win a point." "I didn't burn anything down," Arthur protested, the accusation stinging. "I optimized for compliance and minimized community financial exposure." "The community is better off." "Is it?" Janet turned her head, her eyes blazing with an exhausted sadness. "Ted Harrington is now terrified of you. Brenda Vance wants you dead. And now the entire neighborhood wakes up tomorrow to find their grass won't be cut because you couldn't tolerate 1 centimeter of tire tread on your precious corner. You traded a minor, predictable nuisance for major, unpredictable chaos. That's the opposite of risk mitigation, Arthur. That's ego." The severity of her judgment hit him harder than any threat from Apex Landscaping. He realized he had calculated every external variable, the CC&Rs, the contract fine print, the truck's axle width, but had failed entirely to factor in the emotional collateral damage to the single most important variable in his life, his wife. The next morning, the impact of Arthur's victory became tangible. The streets of the Azalea Glen community, usually immaculate, began to look ruffled. Grass grew slightly too long, forming shaggy edges. Petals drifted onto the sidewalks unblown. The uniform perfection was fracturing, and the neighbors noticed immediately. Arthur went about his usual routine. He checked the corner. The wheel stops were untouched, perfectly concealed once more beneath the resettled sod. The sight gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction. The deterrent was working. The problem was solved, but the real deterrent was Arthur himself. The community was now divided into 2 camps. The Finch heroes, typically the corner lot owners and those who loathed Ted Harrington's arbitrary enforcement, viewed Arthur as the necessary antidote to bureaucratic tyranny. Old Mr. Henderson from 2 blocks over actually brought Arthur a bottle of single malt scotch, calling him the only man who ever read the bylaws closer than the lawyers. The Finch menace, predominantly the board's loyalists and the homeowners associations, who valued predictability above all else. saw him as a domestic terrorist who held the community hostage for his personal grievance. Mrs. Petrov, who was still walking Fluffy, crossed the street to avoid walking past his house. The escalating tension manifested publicly at the emergency meeting called by Ted Harrington 2 days later, not to discuss landscaping, but to discuss Arthur. "We have an ethical and safety problem here, people," Ted pleaded with the room of angry homeowners. "We no longer have a landscaper because Mr. Finch intentionally created a hazard that drove Apex away. We need to vote on authorizing the immediate forced removal of the obstruction and fining Mr. Finch a mandatory $500 per day until compliance is met." A tense, chaotic debate erupted. "He saved us $15,000, shouted a Finch hero. He threatened a worker and created a dangerous trap, countered a Finch menace. Arthur, however, didn't rise to the bait. He sat in the back, silently observing. He watched the division, the anger, the loss of communal tranquility. He had sought order, and he had delivered chaos. He had won the battle against the external threat, but in doing so, he had invited a much more corrosive internal threat. Mrs. Patel finally intervened, gaveling the room to silence. "The board has consulted with outside legal counsel. Mr. Finch's structural supports are entirely on his private property. Because they are subsurface and non-decorative, and because the HOA has already established a legal precedent against fining him for mitigation efforts, our lawyer advises that any forced removal or escalating fines would likely fail in court and incur massive legal fees. Mr. Finch knows the CC&Rs better than we do. The deterrent stays." Arthur had become untouchable, a legal island in a sea of confused rules. That night, Janet packed a small suitcase. She set it next to the bed as Arthur was reading a trade journal in the study. He looked up, the journal slipping from his fingers. "Janet, what are you doing?" "I'm going to my sister's house, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet, resolute. "Just for a few days? I need to remember what it feels like to live in a house where the most important thing isn't control, but kindness." Kindness. Arthur stood up, agitated. "I fought a corporate bully and bureaucratic incompetence to protect our property. Is that not a form of kindness to us? I created a deterrent that is safe, effective, and compliant. I won. You didn't win, Arthur. You just made your problem bigger." Janet walked over to the corner of the study, the sun setting and casting a long, deep shadow. "Do you know why I loved that corner? Because every evening when I watered the petunias, I saw the imperfection of the little ceramic mushrooms and the slight, hopeful curve of the grass line. It was our small, beautiful piece of defiance against all this forced conformity. It was a soft boundary." She picked up the small, chipped piece of ceramic mushroom, the one she had salvaged from Brenda's last destructive run, which had been sitting forgotten on Arthur's desk. "You didn't replace the ceramic with a safe deterrent. You replaced a soft boundary with an aggressive hidden weapon. You built a zero-tolerance zone, and now you've brought that zero-tolerance attitude into our home. I can't live in a zero-tolerance zone, Arthur." She set the mushroom down and walked toward the door. Arthur watched her, the victorious actuary, immobilized by a single crushing truth he had failed to model: the human heart. "Janet, wait." "What do I do?" His voice was a raw plea, stripped of all professional composure. She paused at the door. "Remove it, Arthur. Show me that the peace in our home is more important than the control of that corner." She left. The house was silent. Arthur stood alone in the study, the trophy of his victory, the meticulous, unassailable apex file, mocking him from the desk. The next morning, Arthur Finch drove to the community hardware store, bought a long-handled crowbar, and drove back to his corner. He parked his car, walked to the lawn, and knelt in the fresh morning dew. He located the subtle mound of sod and used the crowbar to lever out the first 50-pound polymer wheel stop. The galvanized steel spikes groaned as they relinquished their hold on the earth. The process was slow, difficult, and profoundly humbling. He was dismantling his own perfect solution. He pulled up the second and the third, leaving 3 visible, dark holes in the freshly settled sod, scars in the earth. As he was loading the final, heavy block into the bed of his truck, Ted Harrington drove by in his golf cart, pulling up slowly. He watched Arthur, his expression unreadable, a mixture of triumph and confusion. "What are you doing, Finch?" Ted asked, his voice cautious. Arthur wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands covered in dirt and polymer dust. "I am removing unauthorized subsurface structural elements." "Ted, I decided the deterrent was creating an unacceptable internal liability." Ted stared at the vacant spaces in the lawn, then at the heavy blocks in the truck. He looked up at Arthur, who finally looked like the man he remembered, a normal, albeit obsessive neighbor, not a legal sniper. "So, you're just giving up the fight?" Ted asked, incredulous. Arthur gave a weary, genuine smile, utterly devoid of the cold calculation he had worn for weeks. "No, Ted. I won the fight. I defeated the threat. I protected the property. But I failed to correctly assess the cost. The cost of absolute control is absolute rigidity. And some things, like grass and relationships, need room to bend." He closed the tailgate with a metallic thud. He looked at the holes in the lawn, now soft, open, and vulnerable again. He knew the next landscaper might still cut the corner. He knew a driver might still trespass. But he was ready to face a repair bill, so long as he didn't have to face an empty house. Arthur drove the truck to an industrial scrap yard on the edge of town. He sold the 3 wheel stops for $35 in scrap weight, a paltry sum for the weeks of effort, expense, and emotional turmoil they had caused. He returned home and spent the afternoon carefully filling the holes with rich, dark topsoil. He bought a bag of grass seed and spread it meticulously over the fresh earth, then watered the patches gently. The corner of 4026 Azalea Drive was now soft, fragile, and vulnerable, waiting for growth. That evening, he didn't call Janet. He simply took the chipped ceramic mushroom from his desk and walked out to the lawn. He found a small, sheltered spot near where the wheel stops had been, and he pressed the little red mushroom into the soft, freshly turned soil. It was the only barrier, the only defense he would ever need. He was betting on human deck,